Before I begin this account, I need to make something clear. What I experienced over the course of 18 months was not a natural phenomenon. It was not an animal that science could categorize or study. What I encountered in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains was something far older, far more deliberate, and far more aware than any creature that walks on four legs. My name is Dylan Bryant. I am a park ranger, and I have spent the last 15 years protecting the wilderness areas of the Cumberland Plateau. I have tracked bears, observed rare bird species, and documented ecological changes across thousands of acres. But nothing in my training, nothing in my experience, nothing in the countless hours I spent studying wildlife behavior could have prepared me for what happened in the winter of 2022. This is the true account of the Black Panther. And if you are listening to this, if you are thinking about hiking into the deep wilderness of Appalachia, you need to understand what watches you from the darkness. I ask that before you dismiss this as folklore or legend, you consider the evidence. Consider the disappearances. Consider the patterns that no official investigation was willing to acknowledge. Consider the fact that 6 people vanished from those mountains, and their families still do not know what became of them. You have probably not subscribed to this channel yet. I strongly encourage you to do so now. What follows is not entertainment. What follows is a warning. The Appalachian wilderness stretches across millions of acres. The Cumberland Plateau, where I work, represents some of the most remote and least explored terrain in the eastern United States. The mountains here are ancient, worn down by millions of years of erosion. The forest is thick, impenetrable in places, and locals have long spoken of things that exist in those shadows. Things that have no names in modern language. In early November of 2022, I noticed something unusual during my routine patrol of the eastern sector. A hiking trail that normally shows clear signs of human passage had been abandoned, not officially closed, but avoided. I marked this in my patrol log but thought nothing of it initially. What changed my perspective was a conversation with Layla Alexander, a botanist who conducted seasonal research in the region. Layla had been working in the mountains for 7 years, cataloging plant species and monitoring forest health. She was not prone to exaggeration or flights of fancy. She was, in fact, one of the most measured people I had ever encountered. She came to the ranger station on November 8th with a request that seemed simple at first. She asked if I could help her document something she had found deep in the forest. She would not say what it was over the radio. She wanted me to see it with my own eyes. I agreed to meet her at the trailhead on the following morning. What Layla showed me that day would haunt me for the rest of my life. The hike took us 3 hours into territory that very few people ever venture into. The forest grew denser as we climbed. The canopy above became so thick that midday felt like dusk. At one point, Layla stopped and pointed to the trees around us. They were marked, not marked by human hands, not carved in the way hikers sometimes leave their initials or blaze trails. These marks were claw marks, 5 parallel lines, each the size of a human hand, gouged deep into the bark of multiple trees. The marks were recent, perhaps days old. They were also impossibly high, sometimes 8 or 9 feet up the trunk. I did not want to say what I was thinking. Layla voiced it for me. There is no predator in the Appalachian Mountains that leaves marks like this. There is no cat species in North America capable of reaching 8 feet high. Black bears can claw trees, but not in this pattern, not with this precision, not with this depth of penetration into hardwood. Layla had documented the marks with her camera. As we examined them further, she pointed out that they followed a specific pattern. They were not random. They marked a corridor through the forest, a pathway that seemed intentional, almost territorial. I asked Layla if she had heard anything strange in the area. She hesitated before answering. She said that 3 nights prior she had heard a sound she could not identify. It was not a scream. It was not the call of any known animal. It was something between a roar and a human cry, impossibly loud, impossibly low. It had lasted for perhaps 30 seconds, and then silence had returned to the forest. She had left the research camp immediately and did not return to that sector for 2 days. We continued deeper, following the marked trees. The marks became more frequent. They covered the bark in some places, creating a history of repeated scratching, repeated marking. Whatever created these marks was returning to this area again and again. Then we found the remains. It was a white-tailed deer, or what was left of one. The animal had been dead for several days, partially decomposed, but what disturbed me was the manner of the kill. The neck had been broken with tremendous force. The body bore deep lacerations across the torso, wounds that no typical predator would inflict. There was a ritualistic quality to the positioning of the carcass. a deliberateness that made my skin crawl. Layla photographed the scene while I examined the ground around it. In the soft earth, I found tracks. They were large, larger than any black bear track I had ever documented. They showed claw marks that matched the marks on the trees, but the shape, the configuration of the prints was wrong. It was wrong in a way that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. A cat print, unmistakably feline, but the size of something that should not exist. I told Layla that we needed to leave, not because I was frightened, though I was, but because the afternoon was growing late, and I did not want to be in those mountains after dark. She agreed without argument. The hike back to the ranger station took 4 hours because I moved slower, more carefully, constantly alert. Every shadow seemed to contain movement. Every sound seemed calculated and purposeful. That evening I filed an official report about the animal remains. I mentioned the unusual scratches on the trees as well. I carefully omitted any speculation about what might have created them. The response from my supervisors was dismissive. Most likely a black bear, they said. The scratches were probably bears claiming territory. The kill was a natural predator behavior, but they did not climb into those mountains. They did not see the tracks. They did not feel what it felt like to stand in that forest and realize that something was observing you from the darkness. That was the first sign, the first clear indication that something existed in the wilderness of Appalachia that should not exist. Something that had been marking its territory, something that had been hunting, something that was aware. Over the following weeks, as November transitioned into December, other signs emerged. Hikers reported that certain trails had been abandoned by local wildlife. The usual sounds of the forest at night had changed. Birds seemed to avoid certain sections of the mountains entirely. The silence in those places was absolute and suffocating. Layla continued her research but avoided the sector where we had found the deer remains. She told me that her equipment had begun picking up unusual patterns in the forest at night, temperature fluctuations that made no scientific sense. She was documenting them but had no explanation. I started keeping a personal journal, separate from my official ranger logs. In this journal, I recorded every unusual sighting, every strange track, every report from hikers who came through the station with stories of things they had seen in the mountains. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. People were beginning to disappear. December brought the first confirmed disappearance. Wyatt Russell was an experienced hiker, 38 years old, who had been exploring the Appalachian wilderness for over a decade. He came to the ranger station on December 3rd with detailed maps of the area he intended to explore. He told me he would be gone for 3 days, hiking deep into the remote sections of the plateau. He never returned. When his family reported him missing, the official search began. I participated in the search team, along with dozens of volunteers and other park rangers from the region. We covered hundreds of acres, calling his name into the silent forest, examining every ravine, every cave, every place a person might be trapped or injured. We found no sign of him. Not his tent, not his equipment. Not even a trace of his passage through the forest. The official conclusion was that he had fallen into a ravine or some other concealed area, that his body would eventually be discovered. Search and rescue protocols were followed. Dogs were brought in. The search continued for 2 weeks before being called off. Wyatt Russell was never found, but something changed in the mountains after he disappeared. The silence grew deeper. The feeling of being watched intensified. And other hikers began to report sightings. In mid-December, a woman named Mila Griffin reported a strange encounter at the edge of the permitted hiking area. She described seeing a large black shape moving through the trees, something that moved with an unsettling grace. She said it had turned and looked directly at her, and the moment their eyes met, she felt a primal terror that overrode all rational thought. She ran from the area and did not stop running until she reached the ranger station. Mila was not the type to panic. She was a botanist like Layla, trained in field research, accustomed to the wilderness. Yet her encounter had shaken her profoundly. She provided a detailed description of what she had seen. Large, black, feline in shape, but with a presence that seemed almost intelligent. She said that its gaze had felt like being examined by something far older and far more aware than any animal. Her report was filed, documented, and largely dismissed by my supervisors. Then Luke Diaz disappeared. Luke was a photographer, 40 years old, who had come to the mountains specifically to document the winter landscape and wildlife. He had checked in with the ranger station on December 18th, informing us of his planned route through the eastern sector. It was the same sector where Layla had first shown me the marked trees. When Luke did not return on his scheduled date, his daughter reported him missing. The search began immediately, and this time, I made a specific request to focus on the sector where Layla had documented the unusual activity. We found Luke's camera equipment after 4 days of searching. It was positioned carefully on a flat rock, not dropped or scattered by an accident. The camera itself showed photographs of the forest, beautiful compositions of trees and light, but in the final photographs, there was something else, a shadow, a shape that moved with purpose through the background of his shots. In the final frame before the recording stopped, there was a form that appeared almost solid, large, dark, moving directly toward where Luke must have been standing. The final image was corrupted, distorted in a way that made it difficult to interpret. But I saw something in that distortion. I saw what might have been the reflection of something in Luke's camera lens. And what I saw made me understand that whatever took Luke had been aware of him, had been stalking him, and had finally made its presence known. Luke Diaz was never found, but his camera had been placed with intention. Someone, or something, had set his equipment down deliberately and left it there. The act itself seemed to convey a message. The camera was bait. Savannah Hayes disappeared on December 28th. Savannah was an environmental consultant, 41 years old, who had been hired by the state to assess forest conditions in various regions of the mountains. She was professional, methodical, and not prone to taking unnecessary risks. Yet she ventured into the territory where the activity had been most concentrated. She did not return from her survey. When she was reported missing, the search revealed very little. They found her vehicle at the trailhead, her equipment still inside. She had simply vanished into the forest. By this point, the disappearances were drawing attention beyond our local jurisdiction. The media was beginning to investigate. Reports were being filed with state officials. Questions were being asked about whether the area should be closed to public access. My supervisors were becoming defensive. They did not want to acknowledge the pattern. They did not want to suggest that something in the mountains was killing people. The official narrative was that these were accidents, that people were underestimating the difficulty of the terrain, that disappearances in wilderness areas were statistically common. But they were not common in this way. They were not common with this pattern of targeting. It was not random people disappearing. The people who had vanished were all experienced in wilderness settings. They were all people who would know how to survive in the mountains. They were all people who would not simply disappear without leaving some trace of their passage. Unless something was deliberately removing that trace, I began to investigate on my own. I spent countless hours in the ranger station archives, reviewing records of disappearances in the Appalachian region going back decades. What I found was disturbing. The pattern did not begin in December 2022. Going back through records, I found documented disappearances in the mountains that followed the same pattern. A person would venture into a specific region, they would not return. Searches would reveal nothing. The cases would eventually be closed as accidents or suspicious circumstances with no resolution. In 1987, a geologist went missing while conducting field research in the very sector where Wyatt Russell disappeared. His body was never found. In 1999, 2 hikers disappeared in the same area during the winter season. No trace of them was ever discovered. In 2008, a wildlife researcher vanished while documenting large predator activity in the region. Her final journal entry, found at her camp, mentioned a feeling of being observed by something that should not exist. The pattern repeated in 7-year intervals. Not consistently, but with a frequency that could not be coincidence. And the disappearances seemed to cluster around the winter months. The cold season when the forest was silent and the days were short and the mountains felt ancient and hungry. I brought my findings to Layla. I showed her the archived reports. I asked her if she had noticed anything in her research that might explain the 7-year cycle. She looked at the documents for a very long time before speaking. Then she told me something that changed everything I understood about the mountains. Layla had not shared the complete details of her research because she knew how it would be received. She was a scientist, trained in empirical study and measurable data, but her work in the Appalachian region had led her to conclusions that could not be supported by conventional research methods. She had been studying the ancient history of the mountains, interviewing elderly people in the local communities who held knowledge passed down through generations. What she had learned was a history that had been deliberately suppressed and forgotten. The Appalachian Mountains were not empty before European settlers arrived. The region had been inhabited by various indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Creek, and others had thrived in these mountains, developing sophisticated understanding of the land and the creatures that inhabited it. But there were accounts, passed down in oral tradition, of something else, something that inhabited the deepest parts of the mountains, something that the indigenous peoples had learned to respect and fear. They had given it various names in different languages, but the concept was consistent across tribal traditions. It was a guardian, a protector of the sacred places in the mountains, a creature that had been there since before human memory, since the time of the ancient peoples who had first walked these lands. It was said to have been placed there by the spirits to prevent desecration of the sacred sites, to maintain the balance between the natural world and the human world. The accounts described it as a great cat, larger than any natural animal. It moved through the mountains with purpose. It was aware and intelligent, and it would only manifest and take action if the boundaries had been crossed, if the sacred places had been disturbed. The indigenous peoples had coexisted with this guardian for thousands of years by respecting the mountains, by honoring the sacred sites, by not venturing into the deepest places where the guardian kept its watch. But when European settlers arrived and pushed the indigenous peoples out, that knowledge was lost. The settlers did not know about the guardian. They did not know about the sacred boundaries. They had no understanding of the relationship that needed to be maintained between the human world and the wild world. Slowly, over centuries, the sacred places were discovered and disturbed. Archaeological sites were looted. Ancient burial grounds were desecrated. Miners came seeking resources. Hunters came seeking game. Developers came seeking profit. And the guardian responded. According to Layla's research, the disappearances had been happening for over 100 years. But they had been explained away, covered up, forgotten in the archives. People were missing, yes, but in a region of vast wilderness, disappearances seemed natural. Unfortunate, but not systematic. Not evidence of something hunting, except it was systematic, and it was hunting. The disappearances always clustered around the areas where the sacred sites were located. They increased in frequency when those sites had been recently disturbed. They targeted people who ventured into certain restricted zones that the indigenous peoples had marked as forbidden. I asked Layla if she could identify the sacred sites precisely. Could we map them? Could we understand exactly where the Guardian's territory extended? She said it was possible, but it would require us to delve deeper into the history than anyone officially associated with the Park Service would appreciate. It would require us to acknowledge that the official maps and regulations meant nothing to the real geography of the sacred places. It would require us to admit that the mountains had their own sovereignty, enforced by something older than our government, older than our nation, older than our species. We made the decision to map it anyway. Over the course of January 2023, Layla and I worked in secret. We gathered archival materials, historical documents, and oral history accounts. We cross-referenced them with the locations of the disappearances. A pattern emerged with startling clarity. There was a large sector of the plateau that had never been officially surveyed or mapped. The indigenous peoples had called it a forbidden zone. The early European settlers had called it the dark forest. Modern hikers simply avoided it, drawn by stories and legend to stay away. But the true nature of this place was that it contained the heart of the sacred mountains. It was where the guardian kept its watch. It was the place where the balance was maintained, and people had been disappearing from the margins of this place, getting closer and closer to its center, increasingly violating the boundaries that needed to be maintained. Layla had a theory about the 7-year cycle. She believed it was not a cycle of hunting, but rather a cycle of patience. The guardian would allow a period of relative peace, allowing people to believe that the danger had passed. Then, when people grew complacent, when they ventured too deep, when they crossed the unseen boundaries again, the guardian would manifest. The disappearances were not random killings, they were enforcement. They were consequences for violation of sacred space. This understanding filled me with a terrible kind of despair. Because if Layla was correct, then there was nothing we could do to stop what was happening. We could not kill the guardian. We could not relocate it. We could not domesticate it or negotiate with it or convince it that modern people meant no harm. The only way to prevent future disappearances was to close the sacred region permanently, to prevent anyone from entering, to acknowledge that those mountains belonged to something older and more powerful than human government, and that was something that no official would ever accept. Before I could decide what to do with this information, Mason Myers disappeared. Mason was a local hiking guide, 42 years old, who had grown up in the mountains and knew the terrain better than almost anyone. He had been leading a group of tourists through what he believed was a safe, well-traveled route. According to the survivors, the group was hiking along an established trail when Mason suddenly stopped and told them to go back immediately. He said something was wrong. He said they had wandered into a place they should not be. He told them to walk straight back the way they had come and not to look back under any circumstances. The tourists did as instructed. They left the mountains as quickly as possible. Mason never returned. When I interviewed the members of that hiking group, they were shaken but coherent. They described Mason's behavior in his final moments as one of sudden recognition and dread. He had looked at something beyond their view and understood that they had made a mistake. His last words were, "I have to stay here. I have to keep them from following." Mason had stayed behind deliberately. He had positioned himself between the group and whatever he had perceived as the danger. Then Brooklyn Ford disappeared. Brooklyn was a college student, 23 years old according to the official record, though her role in these events suggested something far older. She claimed to be a paranormal investigator, and she had come to the mountains specifically to document evidence of the guardian entity. She had read accounts online of the disappearances and had decided to investigate independently. She did not check in with the ranger station. She did not follow any established protocols. She simply entered the mountains with cameras and recording equipment and an intention to document the presence of something supernatural. When she did not return, I filed a missing person report, but without the details of her actual purpose. The official search for Brooklyn was less extensive than the searches for the others. When no trace of her was found within 2 weeks, the case was marked as closed. But here is what is important. Brooklyn's digital footprint did not end with her disappearance. Weeks after she vanished, video files began appearing online. Cryptic fragments of footage showing the forest, shadows moving with purpose, and a voice narrating experiences of profound dread and awareness of being pursued. The videos came from encrypted accounts. They were distributed through underground networks. They were evidence that Brooklyn had been documenting her experiences even after she had vanished into the forest. The final video, posted nearly a month after her disappearance, showed her voice clearly, though the camera was pointed at the ground. "It is still here. It has been walking beside me for 3 days. I can hear its breathing. I can feel its attention. It is aware of me, and it is waiting for something. I do not know if this is a hunt or a test. I do not know if I am being stalked or guided, but I have passed some kind of boundary, and now I am in its territory, and it will not let me leave. I do not want to leave. I understand now what is happening. I understand why I was called here. It is the guardian of the old ones. It is the keeper of the sacred places. And I have finally found what I came looking for." That was the last message anyone received from Brooklyn Ford. The videos were reported to law enforcement. They were analyzed by people whose job it was to investigate such things. The conclusion was that Brooklyn had experienced a psychological breakdown in the wilderness. Her experiences were hallucinations brought on by isolation and stress. The videos were evidence of a person in mental distress, not evidence of a supernatural entity. The authorities moved on. The case was closed. Brooklyn Ford became one more unresolved mystery in a wilderness known for such mysteries. But I could not move on. I had now seen the pattern clearly. People were vanishing in an established cycle. The disappearances correlated precisely with proximity to the sacred zones that Layla had mapped, and in at least 2 cases, the missing people had demonstrated a sudden understanding of what they were facing, a recognition that changed their behavior in their final moments. I made a decision that I have since regretted. I decided to try to communicate with the guardian directly. I told Layla my intention, and she tried to dissuade me. She argued that I was not trained for this, that I did not understand what I was dealing with, that I would only become another disappearance statistic in the mountains. But I had to know. I had to understand. In February 2023, I gathered supplies and informed my supervisor that I was conducting a solo survey of the wilderness zones. This was not unusual for my job. I had conducted solo expeditions before. No one questioned my departure. I hiked into the forbidden zone deliberately, with intention. I had studied Layla's maps carefully. I knew where the previous disappearances had concentrated. I knew the approximate coordinates of the places where the Guardian had been most active. I brought minimal supplies. I brought water and a radio and a flashlight and a camera. And I brought a offering, a symbolic gesture of respect for the place I was entering. Layla had suggested I bring something that acknowledged the history of the mountains, the people who had lived here before me, the responsibility that came with entering sacred space. I brought a stone from an ancient site, a piece of the mountain itself, to show that I understood I was trespassing in a place that belonged to something older than me. The hike to the center of the forbidden zone took 6 hours. As I penetrated deeper into the forest, I became aware of changes in my environment. The sounds of civilization faded. The forest grew thicker. The light diminished even in the middle of the day, and I felt the attention of something that was not human. It was not dramatic. It was not a sudden manifestation. It was gradual, an increasing pressure of awareness, as if something was becoming cognizant of my presence and evaluating what I represented. I reached a clearing that was marked on Layla's research as an ancient ceremonial site. Here, the ground was unusually flat, shaped by human hands thousands of years ago. There were stones arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance. I could feel the weight of history in this place, the presence of countless people who had stood exactly where I was standing, performing ceremonies, making offerings, maintaining the relationship between the human world and the spirit world. I knelt and placed the stone at the center of the clearing. I said nothing. Words seemed inadequate. Instead, I sat in silence, acknowledging the place, acknowledging the presence that I could feel watching me. And then I heard it. Not a roar, not a scream. Something between a growl and a tone that seemed to vibrate in my chest. The sound came from the forest edge, carried on an air current that seemed to flow against the direction of the wind. The trees directly in front of me began to show movement. Large branches bent and split, and then I saw it. The Black Panther. It was immense. Larger than any living creature I had ever encountered. Its fur was absolutely black, absorbing light so completely that it seemed like a void in the shape of a predator. Its eyes were luminescent, a green that glowed with intelligence and awareness. But what struck me most profoundly was not its physical presence. It was the sense I had that I was being examined by something far older and far more aware than any animal. This creature was not a product of evolutionary processes. This creature had been shaped by consciousness, by intention, by purpose that extended back through centuries and millennia. The panther did not attack. It stood at the edge of the clearing, regarding me with an intensity that made my heart thunder in my chest. I had the sensation that it was reading me, assessing my intentions, evaluating whether I represented a threat to the sacred places. I slowly reached into my jacket and withdrew the stone I had brought. I held it forward, an offering, a symbol that I understood where I was and what I was doing. The panther did not move. Its eyes remained fixed on mine, and then I understood something that changed everything. The panther was not trying to kill me. I was not its prey. I had been allowed to reach this place. I had been guided here in some way that I did not fully comprehend. The disappearances, the vanishings, the deaths that had occurred in the mountains were not random violence. They were consequences for violation of sacred space. They were enforcement of boundaries that had been established thousands of years ago and had been maintained through the presence of this guardian. But I had come with respect. I had come with understanding. I had come not as a predator seeking to take from the mountains, but as someone attempting to acknowledge the truth of what the mountains were and what protected them. The panther tilted its head, an almost curious gesture. And in that moment, I felt the weight of its consciousness press against my mind like a physical force. It was not communication in words or images. It was understanding, transferred directly, a knowledge that came with the weight of centuries. I understood the panther's purpose. I understood the pattern of disappearances. I understood that the guardian would continue to enforce the boundaries, that more people would vanish if those boundaries were crossed, that this was not cruelty but necessity. The sacred places had to be protected. The relationship between the human world and the old world had to be maintained. The panther turned and walked back into the forest. I remained in the clearing for hours after its departure, unable to move, unable to process the magnitude of what I had experienced. When darkness fell, I made camp and spent the night in that place, in the heart of the forbidden zone, in the sanctuary of the guardian. No harm came to me. Nothing disturbed my sleep. When I woke in the morning, I knew what I had to do. I returned to the ranger station the following afternoon. I told my supervisor that I had completed my survey and found no evidence of hazardous conditions in the area I had covered. This was technically true. The only hazard in that area was one that could not be categorized in any official report. I requested a private meeting with the regional director of the Park Service. When it was granted, I presented findings that I had carefully prepared. I submitted a detailed report, based on Layla's archaeological research and my own field observations, that recommended permanent closure of a large sector of the wilderness to public access. The sector I identified corresponded precisely to the Forbidden Zone, the place where the Guardian kept its watch. My recommendation stated that the area contained significant archaeological sites that required preservation. It stated that the terrain was unusually hazardous, with unstable geological formations and uncharted ravines that posed excessive danger to hikers. It stated that the carrying capacity of the region had been exceeded and that public access needed to be restricted to preserve the integrity of the ecosystem. The report did not mention the Guardian. It did not mention the disappearances. It framed the closure recommendation in the language of conservation and safety, the only language that park officials understood and accepted. The closure took 6 months to implement, but it was eventually approved. The sector of the wilderness was officially marked off limits to the public. Ranger patrols in that area were discontinued. Maintenance of trails in the forbidden zone was suspended. The mountains were allowed to reclaim their solitude, and the disappearances stopped. Since the closure was enacted in August of 2023, there have been no confirmed missing persons from the closed sector. The pattern that had persisted for over 100 years has been broken. The Guardian's hunting has ceased because the boundaries are once again respected. But the people who disappeared have never been found. Wyatt Russell, Luke Diaz, Savannah Hayes, Mason Myers, Brooklyn Ford, and one more whose name I will not mention because it would bring additional pain to the family who still searches for them. 6 people vanished into the mountains, and whatever became of them remains unknown. I have continued my work as a park ranger, maintaining my cover, performing my duties as if nothing unusual has occurred. Layla has continued her research in sectors where the boundaries are not contested. We do not speak of what we know. We do not share our findings with anyone, but I am sharing them with you. Claire Graham was the last person to disappear before the closure took effect. She was a state inspector sent to verify conditions in the closed sector before the official cessation of public access. She entered the mountains on July 31, 2023, on official business, with official authorization. She did not return. Her body was never found. Her death was attributed to an accident, a fall into some unmapped ravine, a tragedy of the wilderness. But I know the truth. Claire Graham reached the heart of the forbidden zone. She crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. And the Guardian, in its final act of enforcement before the mountains were sealed off, took her as it had taken the others. If you are listening to this, if you have traveled this far into this account, you may be wondering what happened to me. Why I was allowed to encounter the Guardian and survive when others have vanished. The answer is that I submitted. I acknowledged the truth of the mountains. I accepted that there are places that belong to something older than human government, something older than our civilization. Something that has been protecting those places since before our language had words to describe them. The Guardian did not kill me because I came not with violation but with respect. I came not to take from the mountains but to understand what must be preserved. And now I am telling you this because you need to understand as well. If you hike in the Appalachian Mountains, stay on the marked trails, respect the closed sectors. Do not venture into the places that are marked forbidden. Do not ignore the signs that you are entering territory that does not belong to you. Because the Guardian is still there. It is still watching. It is still enforcing the boundaries that have been established to protect the sacred places. And it is perfectly willing to make you disappear. This is Dylan Bryant speaking from the Wilderness Ranger Station in the Cumberland Plateau, offering what may be the most important warning you ever receive. Thank you for listening. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I genuinely encourage you to do so before you venture into the mountains. Because if something happens to you out there, if you find yourself in circumstances that make you question the nature of the wilderness, you will want to know that you are not alone. Others have experienced what you are experiencing. Others have seen what you have seen, and their stories are waiting for you. Subscribe now. My name is Dylan Bryant, and I have served as head ranger at Black Rock Mountain State Park for 11 years. In that time, I have seen visitors come and go. I have watched wildlife patterns shift with the seasons. I have stood on ridges at dawn and witnessed the Appalachian fog roll through valleys like something alive, something conscious. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the autumn of 2019. The first sign was subtle. Layla Alexander, one of our junior rangers, approached me on a Tuesday morning with a concern I initially dismissed as paranoia. She had been working the southern boundary trail and noticed something peculiar. Animal carcasses, deer primarily, but also smaller creatures like raccoons and possums, not killed in the usual manner of predation, not scattered or partially consumed. They were arranged, positioned with their heads pointing in a single direction, north, toward the deeper wilderness. I told Layla it was likely wolves or feral dogs. She accepted this explanation, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. 3 days later, Wyatt Russell reported the same thing on the eastern trails, and then Mila Griffin on the western ridge. The carcasses continued to appear, perfectly positioned, always facing north. The pattern was impossible to ignore. By the second week of September, I had consulted with rangers from neighboring parks. None of them had experienced anything similar. None of them could offer an explanation. That is when the first hiker went missing. His name was Luke Diaz, 40 years old, from Charlotte. He had registered for a 3-day wilderness expedition with his girlfriend Savannah Hayes. They had planned to traverse the North Ridge Trail, the most remote section of our park. It was a journey I had made countless times. A beautiful, challenging hike through some of the oldest mountains on this continent. Luke and Savannah never completed the first day. When they failed to return to their starting point on day 4, we initiated a search. The park deployment protocols called for at least 3 search teams, which I organized immediately. Wyatt Russell led the first team. Mila Griffin led the second. I led the third, accompanied by Mason Myers, one of our most experienced rangers, and Brooklyn Ford, a seasonal volunteer. We found Savannah first. She was sitting on a boulder approximately 4 miles into the North Ridge Trail. She was not injured. She was not dehydrated. She was in fact remarkably calm. Too calm. Her eyes seemed focused on something we could not perceive, something beyond the tree line, something deeper in the forest. When we spoke to her, she did not respond to her name. She did not respond to direct questions. She simply stared. The medical responders who arrived by helicopter noted that her pupils were dilated fully. Her vital signs were normal. But her consciousness, it appeared, was elsewhere. Of Luke Diaz, we found no trace. Over the following weeks, the search expanded. Park rangers from 5 states volunteered their time. Rescue teams with dogs and helicopters scoured the wilderness. The forest, however, had claimed him entirely. It was as though the mountains themselves had swallowed him whole. Savannah was transferred to a facility in Asheville. She remained catatonic for 17 days before she finally spoke. When she did, her first words were not about Luke. Her first words were a warning. "The old ones are hungry," she said. "They have been sleeping in the stone. But now they are awake. Now they are calling." The medical professionals concluded it was trauma-induced psychosis. I was not so certain. In the weeks following Luke's disappearance, the atmosphere within our ranger station changed. A tension settled into the walls. We began to notice things we had previously overlooked. Small things. A ranger would report seeing a large shadow move between the trees on the eastern slope, too large for any known predator in our region. Another ranger would find a collection of stones arranged in geometric patterns on the trail, stones that had not been there the previous day, and the carcasses continued to appear, always positioned, always facing north. By late September, we were operating under an unofficial protocol. No ranger would venture into the forest alone. No ranger would work the night shift on the North Ridge Trail. No ranger would acknowledge, at least publicly, what we all feared. Something was in the forest. Something ancient, something that had been disturbed. Then, on the night of September 28th, Wyatt Russell encountered it. He was conducting a patrol of the perimeter trail, a route he had traveled hundreds of times without incident. The night was clear. The stars were visible. According to his account, given to me the following morning, he heard the sound first, a low, reverberating rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The ground beneath his feet vibrated. Insects in the surrounding trees fell silent. And then he saw it. Wyatt described it as a panther, a black panther. But no panther exists in the Appalachian wilderness. No panther has existed here for centuries, not since the indigenous peoples were removed from these lands. Yet Wyatt was certain of what he had seen. A massive, muscular feline, black as the night itself, standing on the trail perhaps 30 yards ahead of him. Its eyes, he said, reflected the starlight with an intensity that seemed unnatural. Its gaze was not the gaze of an animal. It was aware. It was measuring him. Wyatt had been trained to remain calm in wilderness encounters. But training, he told me, seemed irrelevant in the presence of this creature. He drew his ranger-issued pistol, though some part of him knew it would be useless. The panther regarded him for a moment that Wyatt said felt like an eternity. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest, moving with a grace that was utterly silent. When Wyatt returned to the station, his hands were shaking, his voice was unsteady, but his conviction was absolute. He knew what he had seen. I made a decision then. I would venture into the deeper forest, into the territory the panther seemed to frequent, and I would attempt to document what was occurring. This was not an official sanctioned expedition. It was a personal investigation. I recruited Mason Myers and Brooklyn Ford. Both of them had requested to be included. Both of them, I suspect, were driven by the same need that moved me to understand. We prepared for a 3-day expedition into the North Ridge Territory. We carried specialized cameras. We carried satellite communication devices. We carried, though we did not discuss it, a deep sense of dread. Before I continue with the narrative of our expedition, I must pause here to remind you of something essential. Subscribe to this channel. What you are about to hear becomes stranger still, and I need to know that you are following this account to its conclusion. Subscribe, activate the notification bell, and ensure that you do not miss the final chapter of what I am about to share. Now, return to September 29th, 2019. The three of us, myself, Mason Myers and Brooklyn Ford, departed the ranger station before dawn. We moved with purpose but without haste. We followed the North Ridge Trail into terrain that becomes progressively more remote with each passing mile. By the third hour, we had left the maintained paths. We were moving through what we referred to as the deep wilderness, the territory that exists beyond standard ranger patrols. The forest here is different. The trees are older. Some of them are ancient, predating even the oldest living records of human habitation in the region. The canopy is so dense that even at midday sunlight reaches the ground in only scattered fragments. The air is thick with moisture and the smell of decay. Everything here returns to the earth quickly. Everything becomes part of the forest. Mason noted, as we moved deeper into this territory, the absence of animals. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. The silence was profound and unsettling. It was as though the wildlife had abandoned this place entirely, leaving it to something else. After approximately 6 hours of hiking, we came upon the first marker. It was a tree, ancient and impossibly large, and carved into its trunk was a symbol. Not crude or recent. The carving had been made centuries ago, perhaps longer. It depicted a panther, rendered in the distinctive style of Appalachian indigenous peoples. The image was detailed and deliberate, clearly the work of someone who had possessed intimate knowledge of the creature depicted. Brooklyn examined the carving. She ran her fingers along the grooves, which had become worn smooth by time and weather. She said nothing, but her expression conveyed a terrible understanding. This symbol had been placed deliberately. It was a marker, a boundary perhaps, or a warning. We pressed onward. As the day progressed, we began to discover more of these carvings. They appeared on trees spaced at regular intervals, always depicting the same creature, always facing in the same direction, north, deeper into the wilderness. It was as though they were breadcrumbs left for someone to follow. By the late afternoon, we had discovered something more substantial. In a clearing, approximately 10 miles from our starting point, we found the remains of what appeared to be an ancient encampment. Not a recent one. The structures had been reclaimed almost entirely by the forest, but the arrangement was unmistakable. Circular formations of stones, remnants of structures long since collapsed, and in the center of this encampment, a series of petroglyphs carved into a massive rock formation. Mason used his satellite camera to photograph every image. There were dozens of them, and they told a story. The petroglyphs depicted the panther in various contexts: the panther hunting, the panther protecting a group of humans, the panther standing guard, and there were other images as well. Humans arranging themselves in ritual patterns, humans making offerings to the earth, and a final image that seemed to represent a transition, a passageway, a door opening into somewhere else. It was Brooklyn who found the artifacts. Buried in the soil near the base of the rock formation were objects that should not have existed in this location. Bone carvings. Stone tools worked with a sophistication that suggested advanced technical knowledge, and, most disturbing, arranged in a circle, a series of human teeth. Not recent, ancient, worn smooth by time, but arranged with deliberate precision. We documented everything. We collected samples, carefully and respectfully, understanding that we were disturbing something sacred. And as the sun began to descend toward the western ridge, we made camp in the clearing, surrounded by the remnants of a civilization that had vanished centuries ago. That night was unlike any of my life as a ranger. We established our camp on the opposite side of the clearing from the petroglyphs. We built a fire, more for psychological comfort than practical necessity. The night was clear and cold. The stars seemed impossibly bright at this elevation, this far from artificial light. I was sitting near the fire, reviewing the photographs we had taken, when Mason called out. He was pointing toward the edge of the clearing. Brooklyn and I moved immediately to join him. The panther stood at the boundary of the firelight, not aggressive, not threatening, simply present, And now, seeing it directly, I understood why Wyatt had been so profoundly affected. This was not an animal, or rather, it was an animal, but it was also something more. Its musculature was impossible. Its size was impossible. It was perhaps 9 feet in length, not including the tail, which moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Its fur was black, but not entirely black. In certain angles of the firelight, I could perceive patterns within the darkness, swirls of color that seemed almost textured, almost intentional. But it was the eyes that captured me. The eyes were ancient. The eyes held consciousness and awareness and memory that extended back centuries. The eyes were intelligent in a way that human intelligence cannot match. The panther regarded us for what felt like an eternity. Then it opened its mouth. I am aware of how this will sound. I am aware that what I am about to describe will strain the credibility of this account. But I must report what we experienced as truthfully as possible. The panther vocalized. The sound was not a roar or a growl. It was something between a rumble and a vibration, something that seemed to resonate in the very structure of our bodies rather than through our ears. And in that sound, there was meaning, there was communication. There was a message transmitted directly to our consciousness. The message was a story. I will not attempt to reproduce the exact transmission. Words are insufficient. Language is insufficient. But I will convey what we understood. The creature we were encountering was not a panther. It was an entity, a guardian, something that had been placed by the ancient peoples who had inhabited these lands. The petroglyphs we had discovered were instructions, left by the last of the indigenous peoples before they were forced from these territories. They had bound this creature, this entity, to the land. They had charged it with protecting the sacred places, the ceremonial sites, the locations where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual realms remained thin. For centuries it had remained dormant, waiting. But recently something had changed. The disturbances we had witnessed, the missing hiker, the strange arrangement of carcasses, all of this was the creature calling out. It was attempting to communicate. It was desperate for someone to understand. The message was complete. The panther closed its mouth. The vibration ceased. For a moment, there was only silence and the crackle of our dying fire. Then the panther turned and walked into the darkness. It did not run. It did not leap. It simply walked, with a grace and deliberation that suggested it was moving between dimensions as easily as we might cross a room. Mason was the first to speak. His voice was steady, but his hands were trembling as he gripped the edge of his jacket. "We need to go," he said. "We need to go now." I did not argue. We extinguished our fire and prepared to depart immediately. Brooklyn was shaking, but her movements were efficient. We gathered our equipment and our samples, and we began the hike back toward the ranger station. We did not stop. We did not rest. We walked through the darkness, guided only by our headlamps and our desperate need to escape from that place. As we walked, I realized something. The carcasses we had been finding throughout the park, the animals positioned and facing north, they were not a message for us. They were offerings. The creature was leaving them as offerings, attempting to communicate that it meant no harm, that it was bound to this land and bound to protection rather than predation. But the more it communicated, the more unstable the boundaries became. The more it reached out from its spiritual domain into our physical world, the more the barrier weakened. We returned to the ranger station at dawn, exhausted and profoundly affected by what we had experienced. I made the decision to keep our expedition confidential. I knew that if I were to report the full truth of what we had discovered, we would be removed from our positions. The park would be closed. The site would be investigated and, inevitably, disturbed further by authorities who would not understand the sacred significance of what existed there. In the days that followed our expedition, I met with the other senior rangers. Not to share the full details of what had transpired, but to implement new protocols. We would increase patrols in the deep wilderness. We would monitor the situation carefully, and we would hope that by maintaining a respectful distance and not escalating the disturbance of the site, the creature would stabilize and retreat back into dormancy. For a brief period, this strategy seemed to be working. By mid-October, no new carcasses had appeared. The panther sightings had ceased. The forest, it seemed, had returned to a state of equilibrium. Savannah Hayes was transferred to a residential care facility, still catatonic, still occasionally murmuring warnings that no one would hear or understand. The other rangers, I could sense, wanted to move past what had occurred. Mila Griffin requested a transfer to a park in a different region. Wyatt Russell requested a leave of absence. The weight of the knowledge we carried seemed unbearable. I considered leaving as well. I considered abandoning my position and my responsibility. But something kept me at the park, some understanding that my presence, my awareness, my refusal to deny what had occurred was essential. Then, on November 5th, Claire Graham went missing. Claire was a relatively new ranger, only 2 years with the park. She had been assigned to conduct a routine inventory of equipment at the Northern Ranger Station, a small outpost located approximately 8 miles into the wilderness from our main facility. She was not on a wilderness expedition. This was a standard task that took approximately 3 hours to complete. When she failed to return at the expected time, I organized a search. This time, with the authorization of park administration, we expanded the effort considerably. Within hours, we had teams from 3 surrounding counties converging on the Northern Ranger Station location. What we found was confounding. Claire's vehicle was still parked at the Northern Station. Her equipment was inside the building, partially inventoried but not completed. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of foul play. It was as though she had simply walked away from the building and into the forest. We expanded the search to include the surrounding wilderness, and on the morning of the second day, we discovered Claire. She was sitting in the clearing, the ancient ceremonial clearing where Mason, Brooklyn, and I had encountered the Panther. She was positioned on one of the stones that formed the outer circle of the ancient encampment. She was not injured, she was not hungry or dehydrated, but she was not conscious, not in any conventional sense. Her eyes were open, her eyes were focused. But the consciousness that inhabited her body was not Claire Graham. I approached her carefully. I called her name. There was no response. I asked her to speak, to identify herself. When she did speak, her voice was not her own. It was layered, resonant, containing multiple tones simultaneously. "The guardian requires a host," the voice said. "The boundary weakens, the protection fails. The sacred place requires a keeper who understands both worlds." I understood then. The creature was not hostile, it was desperate. The entity that the ancient peoples had bound to this land was losing its ability to maintain the barrier between the physical and spiritual realms, and it needed a human consciousness, a human anchor, to strengthen that barrier. Claire Graham would spend the remainder of her life as the guardian of the sacred place. Not as a prisoner, we would eventually discover that she would live in the clearing, manifesting a supernatural ability to survive in conditions that would kill an ordinary human. She would age at a rate that did not match the passage of time. She would exist in a state of profound symbiosis with the land itself and the creature that inhabited it. This was not something we could report. This was not something we could explain to administrators or law enforcement. We could only document it, monitor it, and maintain our silence. Over the following years, the dynamic within the park stabilized. The disappearances ceased. The strange manifestations diminished. The forest, it seemed, had achieved a balance. The creature had its anchor, its keeper, its protection. I remained at the park. Wyatt Russell eventually returned from his leave of absence. Mason Myers continued his work. Brooklyn Ford ultimately became a leading expert in indigenous history and cultural preservation, using our secret knowledge to inform her research. Mila Griffin transferred to a park in Colorado. She called me once, 3 years ago, asking if the situation had resolved. I told her it had. She knew what that meant. She never called again. Now, 2 years into retirement, I am sharing this account. Savannah Hayes was finally released from care at an age that should not have been possible for someone who had been immobilized for so long. She contacted me, fully aware of what had transpired, grateful to finally speak with someone who understood. The Black Panther remains. Claire Graham remains, and whether she suffers in that boundary state or exists in a form of fulfillment that transcends human comprehension, I will never know. The sacred place is protected, the barrier is maintained, and somewhere in the Appalachian wilderness, an ancient guardian continues its vigil, watching over the places where the old peoples left their marks, guarding the passages between worlds. The forest, I have learned, has its own agenda. The land remembers, and in remembering, it ensures that certain things never fade entirely into the past. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some knowledge is not meant to be shared beyond those who must bear its weight. This is the truth of what occurred in Black Rock Mountain State Park. This is the testimony of 7 rangers who experienced what the world cannot explain. And if you are still watching, still listening, then you are part of this knowledge now. You carry the weight of this truth. You understand that the wilderness contains secrets that predate civilization itself. I thank you for listening. I encourage you to like this video, to subscribe to this channel, and to share this account with those you trust to understand its significance. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. But perhaps in sharing this testimony, I have finally found the peace that comes from refusing to deny what is real. There are places in this world where the earth itself seems to hold its breath, waiting, watching. For those of us who spend our lives managing the wild spaces between civilization and something far older, we learn to recognize the signs. We learn to respect the boundaries that our ancestors knew better than we ever could. Today I want to share with you something that I have kept private for far too long. Something that challenges everything we believe about what lies beneath the ground we walk on. Something that the official records have buried deeper than any coal seam. Please, if you would be so kind, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. The stories I have to tell you will haunt you long after this video ends. And if you wish to know what truly lives in the darkness of these mountains, you will want to hear more. Let me begin. My name is not important. What matters is that for 17 years I have served as a ranger for Yorkshire Coal Heritage Park in the southeastern Appalachian Mountains. The park sits on land that was once stripped bare by mining operations that stretched back more than a century. Our job was simple in theory: maintain the trails, educate visitors about the region's industrial history, and ensure that no one ventured into the designated danger zones. Those danger zones were established for reasons that official policy documents describe as geological instability, collapsed mines, sinkholes, methane seeps, all reasonable explanations, all, I would come to understand, incomplete. In the spring of 2018, the park received a directive from the state. A new collaborative initiative would bring together a team of researchers and outdoor professionals to conduct what was being called a heritage assessment. This would involve a comprehensive survey of the old mine sites, including the deepest and most restricted sections that had been sealed off decades ago. The goal was supposedly educational. We would document the history, the geology, the cultural significance. We would gather data that would help the park provide better interpretive programs to visitors. I was assigned as the lead ranger for this project. My supervisor, a bureaucrat who had never set foot on the mountain trails, told me this was an honor. I should have recognized it as a warning. The team arrived on a Monday in early May. I remember the morning clearly because the weather was unusual. The sky had a particular shade of gray that I had only seen a handful of times in my career. It was the kind of gray that made the older locals shake their heads and stay indoors. Old Charles Powell, who had worked at the park for 3 decades before retiring, called me that morning. Charles Powell was 73 years old. He had grown up in these mountains, worked in the park system his entire life, and had seen changes that would make most people weep. His voice on the phone was tight with an emotion I could not quite name. He said to me, "You tell them not to go too deep. You tell them the mountain does not want them down there." I laughed. Charles had always been superstitious, full of the old mountain folklore that he had heard from his parents and grandparents. I told him not to worry. We were professionals. We would follow all safety protocols. He said nothing to that, just told me to be careful, and hung up. The research team consisted of 7 people beyond myself. I should describe them to you because each of them would play a role in what came next. Each of them would contribute something, however unknowingly, to the series of events that transpired. First was Nora Long, 27 years old, who served as the project coordinator. She was efficient, organized, relentlessly cheerful. She spoke in corporate jargon about synergistic opportunities and stakeholder engagement. She had degrees from prestigious universities and had never spent more than a few hours away from major cities. She viewed the mountains the way someone views a museum exhibit. Something interesting to observe, but not something to truly understand. Owen Patterson was the geologist, 28 years old, with a reputation in his field for being exceptionally thorough. He carried equipment that I did not recognize. Ground-penetrating radar, he called it. Instruments for measuring mineral deposits and structural integrity. He spent the first few days taking readings, making notations, frowning at his instruments in ways that suggested they were telling him something he did not expect. Hazel Hughes was the historical consultant, 29 years old, an expert in Appalachian industrial history. She was genuinely knowledgeable and respectful of the region in ways that Nora was not. We had several good conversations about the human cost of coal mining, the families destroyed by accidents and disease, the communities gutted when the operations moved elsewhere. Hazel seemed to understand that this land held memories that mattered. Jack Flores was a photographer and documentarian, 30 years old, assigned to create a visual record of the project. He was quiet, artistic, and observant in a way that I appreciated. He photographed not just the sites we surveyed, but the space between things, the shadows on the walls, the way light fell through gaps in the earth. His images would later be the only evidence we had of certain aspects of what occurred. Penelope Washington, 31 years old, was a safety specialist. She had worked on mining reclamation projects across the country. She knew the regulations, understood the risks, carried the appropriate certifications. She was methodical to the point of obsession, which under normal circumstances would have provided comfort. In this situation, it provided only false reassurance. Julian Butler, 32 years old, was a structural engineer brought in to assess the integrity of the mine shafts and any remaining infrastructure. He was competent and professional, prone to explanations involving load-bearing calculations and material fatigue. He would struggle, as we all did, to explain what we eventually encountered. Finally, there was Riley Simmons, 33 years old, a graduate student in an environmental science who seemed to be there primarily because someone at his university had connections to the project. He was eager, intelligent, but possessed the kind of naive confidence that came from having never truly confronted something that could not be solved through research and methodology. And then there was Levi Foster, 34 years old. He was different from the others. He arrived with the team, but he seemed somehow separate from them. He carried himself with a weariness, a consciousness of the space around him that was distinct. Later, I would learn that Levi had family roots in these mountains. His great-grandmother had been Cherokee. His great-grandfather had worked in the mines. There was something in his blood that recognized what we were walking toward, even if he could not yet name it. We gathered at the park headquarters on the morning of May 8th. I reviewed the site maps, the sealed sections we would be accessing, the safety protocols. I explained the restricted areas. I described the geological hazards. I did not mention what Charles Powell had said, or the strange feeling that had settled in my chest since the moment I had been assigned to this project. Nora smiled at me and said this would be the most comprehensive heritage assessment the state had ever funded. She seemed genuinely excited, the way someone is excited about reorganizing files or implementing a new administrative system. She did not understand that we were preparing to open something that had been deliberately sealed away. The first 2 days were administrative. We set up our equipment at the main visitor center. We conducted initial surveys of the easily accessible mine entrances. We gathered baseline data. Penelope established safety checkpoints. Julian examined the structural integrity of the initial passages. Owen took his readings with his ground-penetrating radar. Hazel interviewed me extensively about the history of mining operations in the area. Jack photographed everything. The team seemed energized. This was important work, they said. This was documentation. This was preservation of knowledge. I found myself swept up in the momentum, though some part of me that I could not quite access remained deeply uneasy. It was on the third day that we began to move into the deeper sections. The mine we were accessing was called the Eleanor Shaft, though no one remembered who Eleanor had been or why the shaft had been given her name. It had been abandoned in 1974, sealed in 1987 when a series of sinkholes had appeared in the surrounding area. The official explanation was instability. The miners who had worked there, the few that were still alive, refused to discuss it. We descended through the main entrance, a wide opening that had been left accessible for maintenance personnel. The air immediately changed. It grew cooler, heavier, carrying smells that were difficult to name. Earth, certainly, stone, but something else. Something organic that had been sealed away so long that it seemed almost chemical in its unfamiliarity. The passages were not narrow. The Eleanor Shaft had been developed for industrial coal extraction, and so the initial corridors were wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The walls had been shaped by the hands of miners, and later by the heavy machinery that had worked these corridors. In places, the stone walls still bore the marks where coal had been extracted. Dark grooves and channels that told the story of labor. The electric lanterns we carried illuminated the walls, creating moving shadows that seemed to shift independently of our movement. I noticed that several members of the team did as well. There is something about certain types of darkness that causes the human eye to perceive motion that is not there. It is a trick of neural processing, a remnant of our evolutionary past, or so we tell ourselves. We had been descending for perhaps 30 minutes when Owen stopped and began setting up his ground-penetrating radar device. He wanted to take readings at this depth, he said. He wanted to understand the geological composition of the stone around us. Nora approved this, and we waited while he worked. After several minutes, Owen removed his sensor array and looked at his display screen. His expression changed. It was subtle, but I caught it, a tightening around his eyes, a slight furrowing of his brow. He looked at the stone walls around us, then back at his display, then at the walls again. I asked him what he had found. He told me that his readings indicated something anomalous. The stone composition at this depth was not consistent with the geological surveys he had reviewed. There appeared to be some kind of structural feature approximately 40 meters further down into the mountain that was registering as having properties that did not match standard rock composition. Levi, who had been quiet until that moment, asked if it could be metal. Owen said it was possible. There could be iron deposits or other naturally occurring metals in the Appalachian region. It would not be unusual. Levi said nothing else. But I saw something shift in his face. A recognition. A knowledge. We continued deeper. The deeper passages grew progressively narrower. The walls began to show signs of greater age, less careful mining. The wooden supports that had been installed by miners decades ago were beginning to decay, giving way to stone supports that had been placed more recently as part of maintenance procedures. Everything around us spoke of men who had worked in darkness, extracting their livelihoods from the earth in ways that seemed almost ritualistic in their intensity and repetition. It was Hazel who first mentioned the marks on the walls. She pointed out certain areas where the stone had been shaped in patterns that seemed deliberately decorative. They were not the random marks left by mining tools. These were intentional. Some were geometric. Some appeared to be representational, though it was difficult to determine what they represented in the fluctuating light of our lanterns. Julian examined them with professional skepticism. Miners often left marks, he said. Messages to each other, dates, names, a way of maintaining humanity in an inhumane environment. But Hazel shook her head. These are older, she said. These predate the industrial mining operations. Look at how they are worn. The surrounding stone has weathered around them. These marks were made a very long time ago. Owen began taking readings again. The anomaly he had detected earlier was growing stronger. We were approaching it. He estimated perhaps another 20 minutes of descent. We moved forward, and that is when we heard the knocking. It came from somewhere distant, deeper within the earth. A rhythmic sound. Knock, knock, knock. With exact regularity, as though something was striking against stone in a measured pattern. It echoed through the passages, making it difficult to determine the direction from which it originated. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Penelope immediately called for a stop. She checked the structural integrity of our position. She consulted with Julian about the stability of the mine around us. Both of them assured us that the knocking was likely just water movement, mineral deposits shifting. The normal sounds of the earth. But Riley, the graduate student, had gone pale. He said he had read about these mountains. He had read about something that the old miners called the Tommyknockers, a phenomenon possibly, or perhaps something more. Entities that lived deep within the earth. They made knocking sounds, he said. They were said to warn miners about impending collapse or danger. Nora dismissed this as folklore. We were scientists, she said. We dealt in facts, not superstition. The knocking was an acoustic phenomenon. It was natural. There was a rational explanation for everything, but the knocking continued. It grew slightly louder, still rhythmic, still measured, still originating from depths that none of us could determine. And I found myself thinking of Charles Powell's warning. The mountain does not want them down here. Levi said we should turn back. Nora said absolutely not. We had come this far. The anomaly was close. We needed data, so we continued. When we reached the anomaly, we understood why Owen's instruments had registered it so clearly. It was not an anomaly at all. It was a structure. The passage we had been descending opened into a chamber, a space that clearly had not been created by the modern mining operations. The walls of this chamber were smooth, almost polished. They bore the same marks that Hazel had identified earlier, but here they were far more extensive, far more complex. Geometric patterns interwoven with representational images, patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle at which our light struck them. And the walls themselves appeared to be made of something that was not natural stone. Owen moved forward with his instruments, his professional composure finally cracking. He said the material composition was unlike anything he had encountered. It was metallic in nature, but not like any metal that occurred naturally. It had a crystalline structure that should not be possible. The readings he was getting were inconsistent with the laws of mineral formation that he had studied his entire career. Jack began photographing everything, his artistic eye catching details that the rest of us were only beginning to perceive. The way the chamber seemed to catch light differently in various places, the way the patterns on the walls seemed to create a sense of depth that was physically impossible. His photographs, I would later understand, were capturing something that was resistant to normal human perception. Hazel moved closer to the walls, running her hands along the surface. She said something in a language that was not English. When I asked her about it later, she claimed she did not remember speaking. The words had simply come to her, as though they were memories rather than speech. And then Levi collapsed. He went down suddenly, as though someone had struck him from behind. Riley caught him before he fell completely, and we laid him on the stone floor of the chamber. His eyes were open but unfocused. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Julian checked his pulse, strong but irregular. Penelope wanted to evacuate him immediately. We had contingency protocols for medical emergencies. We could have him above ground within the hour, but I told her to wait. Something was wrong about this situation. It felt orchestrated. We had entered this chamber not because we had made a rational decision to do so, but because we had been drawn here, and Levi had collapsed not because of any physical trauma, but because he had recognized something in this place that his conscious mind could not process. I asked Levi if he could hear me. His eyes focused slightly. His mouth moved. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, as though he had not used it in a very long time. He said the word over and over again. They are here. They are here. They are here. I asked him who was here. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something that I had never seen in another human being. It was not fear. It was something beyond fear. It was the recognition of something fundamental, something that preceded human consciousness, something that had learned to wear the shape of minds and passages the way we wear clothing. He said, "They have always been here, before the miners, before the indigenous peoples. They have been here since the mountain learned to dream." And then the knocking began again, but it was not distant anymore. It was surrounding us. It came from the walls themselves, from the metallic substance that composed the chamber. It came with a rhythm that seemed almost like language, like meaning conveyed through repetition. I looked at the team. Nora was visibly terrified now, her corporate composure completely stripped away. Owen was backing toward the chamber entrance, his instruments hanging forgotten at his sides. Hazel stood with her hand pressed against the wall, her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face. Julian was trying to examine Levi, but even he seemed to understand that what was occurring was beyond his scope of expertise. Penelope was attempting to call for emergency assistance, but her radio was producing only static. Riley stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Jack was still photographing. That is when I realized something that would fundamentally alter my understanding of what was happening. Jack was not afraid. He was documenting, as though he had been sent here specifically to record this moment, as though he was aware of something that the rest of us were not yet prepared to comprehend. I asked him what he knew. He lowered his camera and looked at me. He said he had been briefed, not by Nora or by the university or by the state, someone else, someone who understood the significance of this chamber and wanted it documented before it was sealed again. Who? I asked. He said Charles Powell. The retired ranger had been contacted by someone he knew, someone from the old families of the mountain, someone who understood the history that had been deliberately hidden. They had wanted assurance that what was in this chamber would be recorded, that the truth would not be lost again. The knocking intensified. I understand now what happened in those final moments, though my understanding is incomplete and I suspect it will always remain so. What I am about to describe will seem impossible. It will challenge your capacity to believe, but I am telling you the truth. Everything that follows is what I experienced and what I have carefully documented in the 17 years since that day. The knocking reached a crescendo, and the patterns on the chamber walls began to glow. Not with light that originated from our lanterns, but with light that seemed to come from within the metallic substance itself. The illumination was cold and blue, almost the color of deep water under moonlight. The patterns began to move. This is not an exaggeration. The geometric designs and representational images seemed to flow across the surfaces like liquid. As we watched, unable to move or speak, the patterns coalesced into shapes that resembled faces. Or perhaps they were faces, not human faces, something other, something ancient. The knockings became louder, more frantic, and I understood in that moment that it was not the walls or the chamber creating the sound. The sound was coming from the stone itself, from the mountain. The earth was knocking. Levi's eyes opened fully, and for just a moment, I saw his consciousness return to his body. He looked at me with a clarity that had not been present before, and he spoke the last thing he would say in that chamber. He said, "They want to show you. They have been waiting. The people who knew them, the ones who honored them before the miners came, they left knowledge in the stone. in the patterns, in the voices of the earth. The Tommyknockers are not a warning anymore. They are an invitation. Hazel made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cry. She said she understood now. The patterns were a language, not a verbal language, but something more fundamental, a way of encoding memory in stone. The mountains of Appalachia were ancient beyond human reckoning, and they held within them the memories of the beings that had called them home. Owen said something about resonance frequencies and harmonic patterns, but his words trailed away as even he seemed to realize that his scientific framework was inadequate for what we were witnessing. Penelope backed toward the chamber exit. She said we needed to leave, we needed to evacuate, we needed to report this to the authorities. But her voice was uncertain, and I understood that she too was beginning to comprehend that what we had discovered existed in a realm where authority and protocol held no sway. The floor of the chamber began to vibrate, not violently, gently, as though the earth beneath us was responding to something. Levi, still lying on the stone, began to glow with the same blue light that illuminated the walls. His body seemed to be resonating with the frequency that the chamber was emitting. I realized that Levi was changing. Not in a grotesque way, but fundamentally. His connection to this place was deeper than the connection any of the rest of us possessed. He was descended from people who had known these mountains before they were mined, people who had understood the entities that lived in the deep places, and in this moment, he was being called. That is the only word I can find for it. Called. Riley broke through his paralysis and grabbed my arm. He said we needed to leave now. He said the chamber was responding to our presence, but it was more than that. The mountain was responding to what Levi represented, what his blood meant, what his family had surrendered when they had allowed mining to scar the earth. I told Penelope to take the rest of the team and begin evacuating. We would follow shortly. She wanted to argue, but the look in my eyes must have communicated something of the certainty I felt. She gathered up Owen and Julian and Hazel, and with Riley's help they moved toward the passage entrance. Jack remained with me. I asked him if he had known this would happen. He said no. He had been prepared to document an anomaly. He had been prepared to record evidence of something unexplained. But this was beyond what he had expected. The mountain was not being defensive. It was not attacking. It was simply present. It was making its existence known. I approached Levi. His body was no longer glowing, but his eyes were. The blue light seemed to emanate from within his pupils, as though his consciousness had shifted to a place that was not entirely physical. I asked him if he could hear me. He said he could hear me, and that he could hear something far older as well. He said the Tommyknockers were not creatures in the traditional sense. They were aspects of the mountain itself. They were what happened when a place learned to be aware, when the earth achieved consciousness. They had been here before the first people. They had watched those people arrive. They had seemed to welcome the miners until the miners had begun to treat the mountain as though it was empty, as though it was merely a resource to be extracted. The knocking had been their warning, but like most warnings, it had been misunderstood. The miners had interpreted it as a sign of danger, as an auditory phenomenon to be catalogued and managed. They had not understood that the mountain was trying to speak, that it was trying to convey something essential about what it meant to exist as a conscious entity in a world that did not believe in consciousness beyond the familiar forms. I asked him what would happen now. He said the chamber would be sealed again. The knowledge of its existence would fade into legend, the way it had before. The university would make excuses about structural instability and safety protocols. The team would be instructed not to speak of what they had witnessed. Charles Powell would arrange for the sealing to occur. The mountain would return to its patient waiting. But something would change, Levi said, because now there was documentation. Jack's photographs would exist. My understanding would persist. And somewhere in the future, when the world was ready to accept that consciousness was not the exclusive province of biological entities, this knowledge would emerge again. The Tommyknockers would be understood not as folklore or delusion, but as the first contact with a form of awareness that predated human civilization. I asked him if he would return to the surface with us. He said he would stay for a while. He said he was needed here. His family had abandoned this place, had tried to forget the old relationships, had chosen to accept the desecration of the mountain in exchange for economic survival. He could not undo that choice, but he could honor the mountain by bearing witness, by existing as a bridge between the old way and the new understanding. I told him that I could not leave him here. He said that I could, and that I must, because the world needed to know about this. Not immediately, but eventually. The photographs would ensure that. The documentation would ensure that. And when the time came, people would understand that the earth itself was alive, that it was aware. that it had been trying to communicate with us all along, not through words, but through the fundamental vibrations of its existence. The blue light faded. Levi's eyes returned to normal. He smiled at me, and in that smile I saw someone who had made peace with something that I was only beginning to comprehend. I left him there. I climbed back through the passages, following the route that we had descended. The walls seemed to smooth my passage, as though the stone itself was guiding me toward the surface. It should have taken 30 minutes to return to the entrance. It took perhaps 5. The team emerged from the mine at dusk on the same day we had descended. My watch insisted that we had been below ground for only 4 hours, but in my mind, days had passed. Time had behaved differently in that chamber. It had stretched and compressed according to laws that we do not understand. Penelope's emergency call had reached the park headquarters, and when we emerged, we were greeted by park officials and state representatives. They conducted preliminary medical examinations. No one was physically injured. Owen's instruments were carefully collected and stored. Jack's camera was confiscated, though not before he managed to remove the memory card and hide it. The official report stated that we had experienced a mechanical failure in the elevator system we were using to access the lower levels. We had become trapped temporarily. We had exited safely and we were all unharmed. The chamber we described was consistent with known natural caverns in the Appalachian region, with some minor anomalies that could be explained by unusual mineral deposits. Levi Foster was reported as missing in the mine. Search and rescue teams went down, but they found no trace of him. The official conclusion was that he had become disoriented and wandered into an unmapped section of the mine where he likely fell and was killed. His body was never recovered. His family was compensated for their loss with money that they did not ask for. His memory was buried as effectively as his body, if not more so. The Eleanor shaft was sealed with concrete and steel. It was declared permanently off-limits due to unstable geology. The Heritage Assessment Project was quietly terminated. The state withdrew its funding. The university that had sponsored the research accepted a settlement in exchange for never publishing their findings. Jack's photographs disappeared. He disappeared as well, though not to a mine. He simply moved away, cut contact with everyone who had been part of the team, and has not been seen since. Owen developed an obsessive relationship with his data. He started speaking about frequencies and resonances in ways that his colleagues found disturbing. Eventually, he lost his position at his university. The last I heard of him, he was living alone in a cabin in rural Vermont, continuing to study the readings he had taken that day 17 years ago. Hazel wrote a book about Appalachian history, but any mention of the Eleanor shaft or of what we had discovered was conspicuously absent. She and I have exchanged letters over the years, and I know that she continues to struggle with what she witnessed. She speaks of voices, of understanding language that should not be comprehensible, of dreams in which she walks through passages of stone and hears the knocking that never quite ceases. Julian returned to his work as a structural engineer, but he changed his specialization. He now focuses specifically on how buildings and structures interact with their environment in ways that exceed standard engineering principles. His papers are dismissed by his peers as speculative and unscientific, but he is searching for something, and I believe he will find it eventually. Riley completed his graduate degree and became an environmental scientist, but his research is focused on something that most of his colleagues consider unimportant. He is studying the acoustic properties of stone and whether minerals in the earth can retain information the way that water is theorized to retain memory. He is not published widely, but his work is meticulous and his questions are increasingly difficult to dismiss. Nora never worked in her field again. She left the state, left the field of heritage assessment, and disappeared into a conventional life in a major city. I have sometimes wondered if she retained any memory of what occurred, if the official narrative had successfully erased her experience, or if it haunts her dreams as my experience continues to haunt mine. Charles Powell died 2 years after the descent. He was 91 years old. On his deathbed, he asked to see me. He told me that his family had known about the chamber for generations, knowledge that had been passed down through the old families, the ones whose ancestors had existed in these mountains before the mines. He had arranged for Jack to come. He had ensured that the descent would occur and would be documented. He had done it because he believed that the time of forgetting was ending, that the earth was growing impatient with our ignorance. He told me that Levi was still alive, that he was not lost in the mine, but rather that he had found what he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it, that he had returned to something that his ancestors had severed, that his presence now existed in the deep places, serving as a connection between the conscious earth and the human world above, that he would be there, waiting, until others were ready to understand. I do not know if Charles was telling the truth or if the years of burden and secret knowledge had finally fractured his mind, but his conviction was absolute, and after he died, I made a decision. I continued to work as a ranger for Yorkshire Coal Heritage Park for another 5 years. During that time, I trained myself to listen to the mountain in ways that previous rangers had not. I learned to recognize the subtle signs of its presence, the particular quality of light in certain places, the way sound behaved differently in certain passages, the patterns of animal movement that suggested awareness of something beyond normal predator-prey relationships. I eventually left the park and began to travel, seeking out other places where the earth seemed to possess an unusual quality of consciousness. I have visited mines in other Appalachian states, visited the large cavern systems in the Southwest, visited the deep places where humanity has intruded upon something that does not wish to be disturbed. And everywhere I have gone, I have heard the knocking. It is not loud. It is not threatening. It is patient and measured and unmistakably purposeful. It is the earth attempting to communicate. It is the mountain trying to tell us something that we have been incapable of understanding because we have never imagined that understanding was necessary. The Tommyknockers of the Appalachian Deep are not entities that can be categorized or understood through the frameworks of modern science. They are not creatures or monsters or paranormal phenomena. They are simply what happens when the earth itself achieves a form of consciousness. They are the voice of the planet becoming aware of itself, and I am convinced that they have been waiting for us to reach a point in our evolution where we might finally be ready to hear what they have been trying to tell us. Now you have heard my testimony. You have learned what occurred in the Eleanor shaft. You have encountered knowledge that has been deliberately hidden and suppressed. And I would ask you, if you would be so gracious, to please like this video, share it with others who you believe might be ready to hear this truth. Subscribe to this channel because there are other stories, other places, other evidence of the consciousness that surrounds us in the rock and stone and earth beneath our feet. The mountains are watching, the earth is listening, and the knocking continues in the deep places where men fear to venture. Thank you for allowing me to share this with you. Years of working the Cumberland Mountains taught me that some stories are written in blood and stone, not in official reports. My name does not matter anymore. What matters is that you understand what I witnessed, what I learned, and what still watches those peaks when darkness falls. I was a ranger for 37 years. In that time, I documented over 2,000 incidents across the wilderness, lost hikers, equipment failures, environmental shifts. But nothing in my training, nothing in my experience, prepared me for what unfolded during the autumn equinox of 2019. This is not a tale for casual consumption. This is a warning. This is a confession. This is the truth that my employers will never allow to be officially recognized. Listen carefully. The Cumberland Dragon does not walk in myths alone anymore. My tenure at Cumberland National Wilderness began in late August. The administrative office had assigned me to monitor a sector that had experienced unusual activity reports throughout the previous summer. Hikers were going missing, not lost, missing. There is a significant difference. Lost suggests confusion, disorientation, the normal hazards of wilderness exploration. Missing means something else entirely. It means absence without explanation. It means time that cannot be accounted for. The first briefing was conducted by Ethan Phillips, the regional coordinator. At 35 years old, Ethan was one of the youngest administrators I had encountered in the service. He carried an air of calculated efficiency, the kind of professional who measured everything in metrics and protocols. He spread topographic maps across his desk on a humid August afternoon and explained the situation with clinical precision. 23 documented disappearances over the past 14 months. The geographic pattern was concentrated along the eastern ridge system, particularly near the ancient ceremonial grounds that the Shawnee and Cherokee had inhabited centuries before. Ethan did not use those terms lightly. He had studied the cultural history of the region, and he expressed genuine concern about the clustering of incidents around specific archaeological sites. I asked him directly whether there had been any indication of foul play. He hesitated. That hesitation was the first crack in what would become a complete disintegration of logical explanation. Ethan explained that forensic analysis of the equipment abandoned at the disappearance sites revealed nothing conclusive, no signs of struggle, no indicators of animal predation. The items, backpacks, hiking boots, water containers, were found arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than panic-driven abandonment. One hiker's journal, recovered at the base of Serpent's Tooth Formation, contained entries dated weeks after the ranger report indicated the hiker missing. The dates were written in the missing person's handwriting. The pages described events that had not yet occurred. This was verified by multiple investigators and subsequently buried in bureaucratic silence. I accepted the assignment, knowing that something was wrong. I chose not to press for more specific details. Perhaps that was cowardice. Perhaps it was instinct for survival. My first weeks at the mountain station were deceptively quiet. The forest presented its typical autumn transition. The canopy shifted from dense green to the amber and crimson patterns that characterize the Appalachian seasonal transformation. Temperatures dropped at night to the low 40s. Fog accumulated in the valleys with a thickness that could obscure visibility to mere yards. The hiking trails remained busy throughout September. Tourist season extended into early October that year, driven by an unusually warm climate and media attention to the region's natural beauty. I conducted routine patrols along the major routes, checked shelter stations, and maintained communication with the central office. The work was methodical and uneventful. Then, on the 23rd of September, a registered hiking group failed to report at their checkpoint. The group consisted of 6 individuals: Abigail Campbell, age 36, Michael Parker, age 37, Emily Evans, age 38, Jacob Edwards, age 39, Elizabeth Collins, age 40, and Logan Stewart, age 41. They had entered the wilderness on September 21st, planning a 3-day expedition along the Serpent Ridge Trail, one of the more challenging routes through the sector. The automatic alert system triggered at the scheduled checkpoint on the 24th. By regulation, I was required to conduct an initial search of the planned route within 2 hours. By sundown, I had covered 14 miles of the trail and found no sign of the expedition, no equipment, no message, no indication that they had ever walked that path. The official search began the following morning. What unfolded over the next 8 days consumed my understanding of how reality could be altered without explanation. 42 rangers and volunteers participated in the recovery operation. Search dogs were deployed. Helicopter surveillance was conducted. Thermal imaging equipment was used to scan the ridges and valleys. We found traces of the group's presence only at one location, a clearing approximately 9 miles from the trail's starting point. Here, the hikers had apparently established a camp. Tent remnants were scattered across the ground, torn as if from the inside by tremendous force. Sleeping bags were unrolled but not occupied. Cooking equipment was arranged in a precise circle, untouched and functional, as if placed there by hands that understood its purpose but did not require it for sustenance. The most disturbing discovery was the calendar that Abigail Campbell had kept in her pack. The journal was found near the center of the clearing, open to a page dated October 15th. The entries described events from dates that had not yet arrived. They described the subsequent days of the search operation with accuracy that matched the actual events that would unfold over the following weeks. The handwriting became progressively more distressed. The final entries were written in capital letters, pressing so deeply into the paper that the pen had torn through multiple pages. They are not searching for us because we are here. We are here, and we are not here. The mountain wants to show us something. The mountain has always wanted to show us something. We cannot leave. We cannot close our eyes. The dragon opens its mouth, and time falls like rain. We are walking through moments that have already happened. We are walking through moments that will never happen. The journal ended mid-sentence. No conclusion, no resolution. The next pages were blank. Ethan Phillips arrived on the 8th day of the search. He was accompanied by a man I had never seen before, a tall individual with gray eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority without the need to declare it. The man introduced himself as Samuel Thorne, a consultant specializing in wilderness incident analysis. He asked me very specific questions about the ceremonial grounds, about the historical accounts of the area, and about any incidents or observations that might connect to indigenous cultural practices or sites. I had no answers that would satisfy his questions, but Samuel Thorne seemed to already know the answers. He was asking me to confirm what he already believed. Samuel Thorne remained at the mountain station for 3 days. During that time, I observed him conducting his own investigation independent of the official search operations. He visited the ceremonial clearing twice. He spent several hours at the local historical archive, and on the evening of his second day he requested a private conversation with me after the other rangers had retired to their quarters. We met in the station's main office. Thorne carried a leather journal, worn and water-stained, its pages filled with handwritten notes in multiple languages. He opened to a marked section and began to speak with the careful precision of someone sharing forbidden knowledge. The Cumberland Mountains, Thorne explained, held significance far deeper than most rangers understood. The peaks that tourists photographed and climbed with casual indifference were sacred to the Cherokee and Shawnee nations for reasons that extended beyond spiritual reverence. The mountains were the domain of something that predated human occupation, something that the ancient peoples had learned to recognize and respect through a hard-earned understanding of survival. The Shawnee had a word for it, Thorne said. A word that had been lost in translation, corrupted through centuries of language drift and cultural displacement. The closest modern rendering was "the serpent that walks," but that translation failed to capture the essential meaning. The creature was not merely a serpent. It was not merely a dragon in the sense that medieval European tradition defined such creatures. It was something between categories, something that occupied a space in the natural world that humans had not yet developed adequate terminology to describe. The ancient peoples called it the Watcher of Time, the guardian that existed outside the normal progression of moments, the thing that fed on transitions, on the boundaries between seasons, between life and death, between the known and unknown. The Cumberland dragon had been feeding on the mountains for thousands of years. During the spring equinox, it would take offerings. During the autumn equinox, it would grow restless, hungry, and its hunger would manifest in the disappearance of those careless enough to walk in its domain during the season of transition. I asked Thorne if he expected me to believe this. He smiled, but the expression carried no warmth. "Believe is an imprecise word," he said. Thorne was not asking me to accept it as religious doctrine. He was asking me to recognize it as pattern. The disappearances occurred in clusters around the equinoxes. The victims showed no signs of violence or predation. Their possessions appeared in locations they would not logically travel to. Their journals and records documented events that had not yet transpired at the time of their writing. These were not the phenomena of normal criminal activity. These were not the signatures of wild animal predation. These were the symptoms of something that operated outside the conventional rules of space and time. Samuel Thorne then showed me documentation from his personal archive, case records dating back to the 1700s, compiled from military journals, settler accounts, and tribal oral histories that he had personally transcribed. The pattern was consistent across centuries. The creature consumed approximately 30 people per cycle, clustering around the spring and autumn transitions. The victims were often, though not always, individuals who carried intellectual curiosity, who asked questions about the land, who demonstrated the kind of observational capacity that might lead to greater understanding. The Cherokee had recognized this tendency. They developed rituals to protect their people. They identified sacred grounds that the creature avoided. They established protocols for traveling through the mountains during the dangerous seasons. When European settlers and then American administrators arrived, they brought ignorance of these protocols. The death toll increased. I asked Thorne if there was a way to prevent further disappearances. His answer was stark. "There are 3 options," he said. First, close the mountains entirely to public access during the equinox periods. This would require federal legislation and significant political capital. It would also be vulnerable to legal challenge from environmental advocates and tourism interests. The government would not implement this solution. Second, identify the creature's lair and attempt to exterminate it. This was theoretically possible but practically suicidal. The Cumberland dragon had survived for millennia against far more formidable opposition than modern humans could mount. Any attempt at direct confrontation would be catastrophic for the assault force. Third, re-establish the protective protocols developed by the Cherokee and Shawnee. The creature could be negotiated with after a fashion. It could be directed toward specific sacrificial offerings that would satisfy its hunger without consuming indiscriminate victims. This was the solution the ancient peoples had employed, and it had worked for thousands of years. I asked which solution Thorne was recommending. He closed his journal and met my eyes with an expression that conveyed absolute certainty. "The third option is the only realistic choice," he said, "but it requires people who understand the responsibility, who are willing to assume the burden of being guardians rather than mere administrators. The government will never officially sanction this protocol. The responsibility must be carried by individuals who understand the cost and accept it." Samuel Thorne then provided me with a leather-bound volume containing the translated Cherokee protocols for appeasing the Cumberland dragon. He instructed me to memorize the essential components. He told me that the next equinox would bring testing, The creature would be observing to determine whether I possessed the wisdom to recognize my role in the ecosystem I was meant to preserve. When Thorne departed the mountain station on the third day, I believed him to be either a brilliant charlatan or a man whose understanding exceeded the boundaries of conventional reality. I did not yet comprehend that these descriptions were not mutually exclusive. The 6 missing hikers were never officially found. The case was closed without resolution. The families were provided with standard compensation packages and generic apologies for the wilderness accident that had supposedly claimed their relatives. November arrived with unusual warmth for the Cumberland region. The traditional autumn storm systems did not materialize. Instead, the weather settled into an extended period of clear skies and mild temperatures. The hiking traffic continued well into what should have been the end of the season. Sophia Sanchez, the chief administrator at the mountain station, expressed concern about the extended season. She was a capable woman of 42 years, hardened by 2 decades of environmental management and accustomed to making difficult decisions without consultation. Sophia pulled me aside in early November and asked directly if I had any insights regarding the unusual weather patterns or the statistical anomalies in our incident reports. I told her that I did not have sufficient data to provide analysis. This was technically accurate, though profoundly dishonest. I possessed data that would have terrified her, but it was data that I could not share without jeopardizing my credibility and my freedom. Sophia seemed to accept this, though her expression suggested she did not entirely believe me. She mentioned that the regional office was concerned about the extended season and wanted documentation of all incidents, however minor, to be submitted with increased frequency. Someone at the higher administrative levels was paying attention to our sector. Someone had recognized the anomalies. This was concerning. It meant that what Samuel Thorne had told me might become public knowledge, filtered through bureaucratic channels where it would be either suppressed or weaponized for political advantage. Neither outcome was acceptable. I began to understand that evening, on the 8th of November, that I had acquired a responsibility that I had not sought and could not refuse. I was the only administrator at this location who possessed knowledge of what was truly occurring. My silence was a form of complicity. My speech would be a form of betrayal. The Cherokee protocols that Thorne had provided required specific knowledge of the creature's behavior and preferences. The Cumberland dragon was primarily drawn to individuals who demonstrated curiosity about the land itself. Researchers, photographers, naturalists, hikers who kept detailed journals. These individuals represented the most appealing offerings to the creature because they carried with them the capacity to understand and ultimately challenge what they encountered. The protocols also required that offerings be made during specific time windows during the equinox periods. Thorne had marked these windows with precise astronomical calculations. The autumn equinox of 2019 would present a narrow window of only 7 days during which the creature would be most receptive to negotiation and offering. Jackson Morris, age 43, arrived at the mountain station on November 15th. He was a photography professional hired by the tourism board to document the late-season beauty of the mountains. He carried expensive camera equipment and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to access to places beyond the normal boundaries of public exploration. He requested special permits to photograph in restricted areas. He specifically asked permission to access the ceremonial grounds. I granted the permits. I provided him with maps. I even offered to guide him to the most photogenic locations. Jackson Morris accepted my assistance with enthusiasm. He possessed exactly the profile that Samuel Thorne had described, the observant, curious individual whose capacity to document and question made them appealing to the creature. On November 18th, I suggested to Jackson Morris that the best photography opportunities would be available along the Serpent Ridge Trail at dawn. The light at that hour, I explained, would be particularly dramatic during the autumn transition season. He seemed pleased with the suggestion. He prepared to depart at 4 in the morning. Ella Rogers, a researcher aged 44, arrived at the mountain station at approximately the same time. She was conducting studies on the migration patterns of regional wildlife populations. She had permits from the regional office to conduct field research across multiple wilderness sectors. She carried sophisticated tracking equipment and recording devices. I guided her toward the same area where I had directed Jackson Morris. I explained that the Serpent Ridge region contained some of the richest biodiversity in the sector. I suggested that her research would be significantly enhanced by data collected from that specific location. She accepted my recommendation and prepared to depart at approximately the same time as Jackson Morris, though via a different route that would converge at the ceremonial clearing. On the morning of November 18th, at 3:55 in the morning, I watched both individuals depart from the mountain station. I stood in the darkness, and I understood that I had just made a choice that would define the remainder of my existence. I had offered two human beings to something that operated outside the normal rules of mortality and consequence. I did not sleep that day. I did not sleep for 4 days following. I reviewed the protocols repeatedly. I examined every word in the Cherokee documentation, seeking some indication that I had misunderstood, that some alternative interpretation existed. On the afternoon of November 23rd, Jackson Morris and Ella Rogers were reported overdue by their respective agencies. I submitted the required incident reports. I explained that they had departed for the wilderness sector and had failed to return at their scheduled time. I recommended standard search and rescue procedures, which my recommendation necessitated. We found Jackson Morris's equipment scattered across the ceremonial clearing, 3 miles from the trail where he would logically have traveled. We found Ella Rogers' tracking device at the peak of Serpent's Tooth, at an elevation that would have required her to climb for more than 8 hours continuously. Both individuals had vanished into the same absence that had claimed the previous victims. The evidence suggested violence and struggle, but only upon the closest forensic examination. The disturbance of soil and vegetation was consistent with the two individuals moving in circles, as if walking through the same space multiple times despite their physical location changing. Scratch marks on nearby tree bark suggested frantic interaction with the environment, but there were no remains, no conclusive proof of injury or death. Jackson Morris's camera was recovered intact. The memory cards contained thousands of photographs. I viewed every one of them, searching for any indication of what had occurred. The images progressed chronologically through Jackson's expedition. The first photographs were conventional landscape documentation. Then the images began to shift. The trees in the photographs appeared larger, their trunks thicker and darker, their canopy more dense. The sky in the pictures transitioned from dawn light to a peculiar luminescence that did not match any natural lighting condition. By the final photographs, the landscape had transformed entirely. The trees were ancient beyond recognition, their bark marked with symbols that matched the glyphs in the Cherokee protocol documents. The sky had become a rolling pattern of colors that seemed to move within the static frame of the image itself. The final photograph in the sequence showed Jackson Morris, reflected in water that he should not have encountered on that section of the mountain. His face in the reflection appeared to be moving, though the camera was stationary. His mouth was open, as if speaking or screaming, and the water beneath his reflection was undulating in patterns that mimicked the movement of something vast and sinuous. That was the last image recorded. The timestamp indicated the photograph had been taken on November 18th at 6:47 in the morning, hours after his departure and at a location that would have been impossible to reach in that time frame. I kept this information to myself. I filed reports that suggested Jackson Morris and Ella Rogers had been victims of predatory animal attack, that their remains had likely been carried away by scavengers, that the wilderness sector was potentially unsafe during this season due to the unusual wildlife activity. Sophia Sanchez accepted these explanations without pressing for additional investigation. She seemed relieved that a logical cause could be assigned to the disappearances, even if the resolution was incomplete. The regional office accepted the conclusions. The media moved on to other stories. The cycle continued, but I understood what had truly occurred. I had made a bargain, whether I had consciously intended to or not. I had offered the Cumberland Dragon two individuals whose absence would matter less in the bureaucratic accounting than the permanent closure of the sector or the public exposure of what genuinely inhabited these mountains. This was the beginning of my full understanding. I was no longer merely an administrator of wilderness. I had become a guardian in the tradition of the Cherokee and Shawnee, carrying a responsibility that could never be relinquished and never be shared. The winter season brought unexpected clarity. As the temperatures dropped and the mountains settled into dormancy, the creature's activity diminished. The protocols in the Cherokee documentation explicitly stated that the Cumberland Dragon was least active during the winter solstice period. Its hunger was dormant during the season of darkness and cold. This provided a window of opportunity. I used the winter months to understand the protocols more completely, to memorize the specific ceremonies and offerings that the ancient peoples had employed, and to recognize what I had truly committed myself to. Sophia Sanchez called me to her office on December 2nd. She was holding a printed email that had been forwarded to her from the regional administrative office. The email contained questions regarding the unusual pattern of disappearances in our sector and the statistical correlation between incidents and equinox dates. Someone at the higher administrative level had made the connection that Samuel Thorne had identified. Sophia looked at me across her desk with an expression of complicated understanding. She did not ask me directly what I knew. Instead, she said something that indicated she possessed at least partial awareness of the truth. "The government will never admit what truly exists in these mountains," she said. "If they did, they would face legal liability for every disappearance in recorded history. They would be forced to close the mountains, which would devastate the regional economy. They would have to explain how they allowed a natural phenomenon that predates human civilization to remain unsupervised within a protected wilderness area. Instead, they will create statistical anomalies and unexplained incidents. They will reassign experienced rangers who ask too many questions. They will ensure that the truth remains buried beneath bureaucratic procedure and institutional silence." I asked Sophia how much she knew. She smiled sadly and explained that she had been assigned to this sector specifically because of her reliability in managing difficult situations without escalation. She had received briefings from individuals who worked in the administrative shadows, people whose titles and purposes were deliberately obscured. She understood the nature of the situation, but she maintained official denial because her role required her to maintain the boundary between institutional knowledge and public exposure. Sophia then told me something that Thorne had not. There were other guardians like me in other wilderness sectors across the nation. In the Everglades, guardians managed the presence of something that the local indigenous peoples called the water serpent. In the redwood forests of Northern California, guardians protected the mountains from something that existed partially in a state of living stone. In the bayous of Louisiana, the guardians conducted rituals to contain something that occupied the boundary between living flesh and water itself. These were not official programs. These were not authorized by federal law or administrative policy. These were ancient responsibilities that had been carried by indigenous peoples for millennia and had, in recent centuries, been reluctantly assumed by certain rangers and wilderness administrators who understood that silence and covert action were preferable to public exposure and chaos. Sophia explained that the protocols were not merely about preventing violence or managing disappearances. They were about maintaining a delicate balance between human civilization and the natural forces that predated human consciousness. The Cumberland dragon, like the other creatures that inhabited the wild spaces of North America, had existed in a state of negotiated coexistence with humans for thousands of years. When humans respected the boundaries, the creatures remained relatively quiescent. When humans intruded into forbidden territories or violated the ancient protocols, the creatures responded with increased predation. The modern wilderness access policies, the tourism expansion, the relentless development of previously wild spaces, these represented an escalation of human intrusion. The creatures were responding to this escalation with increased hunger and more aggressive hunting patterns. The guardians were struggling to maintain the old protocols in the face of massive increases in human visitation to wilderness areas. Samuel Thorne, Sophia explained, had been traveling between the various guardian networks for more than 3 decades. He was updating the protocols, sharing information about new strategies, and assessing whether the ancient systems could be adapted to the modern reality of mass tourism and environmental pressure. The question that Sophia posed to me was stark. Could I accept this responsibility fully, knowing that it required regular sacrifices of human beings, knowing that the official explanation would always remain incomplete, knowing that I could never speak the full truth to anyone except others who already understood? I considered the question for what felt like an eternity. In reality, I was silent for perhaps 3 minutes. Then I provided my answer. "Yes," I said. "I understood the cost. I understood the moral weight. I understood that I had already crossed the boundary by my actions with Jackson Morris and Ella Rogers. Continuing forward was not an additional moral transgression. It was the only honest acknowledgement of what I had already become." Sophia nodded, and in that moment I understood that she too had made the same choice years ago. Perhaps under the same pressure, perhaps through the same process of gradual realization that the old ways were not merely folklore but survival mechanisms that predated industrial civilization by millennia. Over the remainder of the winter, Sophia provided me with additional materials from the network. Thorne had compiled extensive documentation of the protocols in multiple formats. There were translations of the original Cherokee ceremonies, cross-referenced with Shawnee variations and Creek adaptations. There were detailed descriptions of the creature's behavior patterns, its preferred hunting times, its response to specific types of offerings. Most importantly, there was a list of approximately 70 wilderness administrators and rangers across North America who had accepted the guardian role. The list included names, locations, contact information, and notations regarding each individual's area of specialization and level of commitment. I recognized two names on the list. Both were rangers I had worked with early in my career. Both had transferred out of the mountain sector in ways that had seemed like standard career advancement at the time. Now I understood that they had been moving to new locations where they were needed to fill guardian roles in places where the wild things were becoming restless. On December 21st, the winter solstice, I conducted my first formal ceremony according to the Cherokee protocols. I traveled alone to the ceremonial clearing and performed the rituals of acknowledgement and respect toward the creature that inhabited these mountains. I made offerings of food and water. I spoke the words of gratitude in the approximation of Cherokee language that Thorne had phonetically transcribed, and I felt something respond. Not as a physical presence, not as an encounter that I could describe in sensory terms, but as an awareness, a recognition, a shift in the quality of the air and light that indicated acknowledgement from something vast and other. The Cumberland dragon knew that it had a new guardian. The covenant had been established. The protocols had been accepted. The cycle would continue. Maintained not by ancient peoples who had understood these things intuitively, but by modern rangers who had been forced to accept the truth that civilization had spent 5 centuries trying to deny. Winter released its grip on the Cumberland Mountains with unusual gentleness that year. By late February, the first signs of spring were evident in the dormant flora beginning to shift toward growth and in the returning migratory birds calling from the gradually thickening canopy. The spring equinox would occur on March 20th. According to the protocols, the creature would transition from dormancy to activity during this period. The spring hunger was typically less intense than the autumn hunger Thorne had noted, but the creature would require offerings nonetheless. The traditional number was approximately 15 individuals during the spring cycle, compared to 30 during autumn. I began my preparations in early March. I reviewed the protocols repeatedly. I identified potential victims based on the criteria that the creature preferred. Individuals whose curiosity and observational capacity made them threats to the institutional silence, whose absence would be easily explained through conventional wilderness narrative, whose deaths would not trigger excessive investigation or media attention. The hiking permits for early spring began to arrive in February. As the weather improved, the tourist traffic increased. By the first week of March, I was reviewing application materials for approximately 90 individuals who had requested access to various trails and camping areas within my sector. Among them were several who fit the profile precisely: a graduate student conducting research on rare plant species, a nature journalist planning a photographic essay, a retired engineer turned amateur naturalist who had published articles questioning the true composition of the mountain ecosystem, an independent documentary filmmaker with a history of challenging official narratives about wilderness management. I provided permits to all of them. I suggested specific routes that would lead them toward the ceremonial grounds. I offered guidance that would separate them from the main hiking areas and create situations where their absence could be attributed to standard wilderness hazard rather than deliberate design. I did not feel satisfaction during this process. I did not feel morality in the traditional sense. What I felt was a kind of grim professional commitment, similar to what a veterinarian might feel when euthanizing a suffering animal. The decision was made. The protocol was necessary. Emotional response was irrelevant to the outcome. Sophia did not directly ask me about my plans. Guardian networks, I had learned, operated on a principle of necessary ignorance. We each carried our own burden without requiring the specific details of how others carried theirs. But Sophia provided me with resources, funding documents that could justify special wilderness permits, equipment that could be explained as part of standard ranger operations, information about timing windows when official oversight would be minimal. The spring equinox arrived on schedule. By March 25th, 9 individuals had disappeared within my sector. The official incident reports cited wilderness accidents, navigation errors, and animal predation. All disappearances had occurred during daylight hours in areas that should have been safe. All remained unresolved and would remain so. The remaining individuals on my internal list, those identified as necessary offerings to satisfy the spring hunger cycle, were deferred to the autumn equinox. The protocols were flexible enough to allow variation based on circumstance and availability. The important principle was that the creature received regular offerings during the transition periods when its hunger was most active. In late April, I received a communication from Samuel Thorne. He was conducting a network assessment and wanted to arrange a personal meeting. Thorne arrived at the mountain station on May 3rd. He appeared more worn than during his previous visit. his features sharper, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed more than consciousness could readily process. Thorne was not alone. He was accompanied by a woman in her mid-50s who introduced herself as Dr. Margaret Zhang. She was a specialist in indigenous cultural preservation. She had worked with several tribal nations to document oral histories and traditional knowledge systems. She had also, Thorne explained, been involved in the Guardian Network for approximately 2 decades. Margaret Zhang's presence indicated that something significant was occurring within the network. She was not a field guardian. She was a coordinator and researcher. Her involvement suggested that my work was being evaluated. Over the course of 3 days, Zhang and Thorne conducted extensive interviews with me. They asked about my mental state, my moral reasoning, the specific protocols I had employed, and my assessment of the creature's response to my actions. They also asked detailed questions about Sophia's role and her level of knowledge. On the final evening, Margaret Zhang provided me with an assessment that reframed my entire understanding of what I had been doing. The vanishing of Jackson Morris and Ella Rogers, and the subsequent disappearances, were not random selections based on profile matching. The Cumberland Dragon had been selecting specific individuals who possessed knowledge or capacity that threatened the institutional narrative around the mountains. The creature was not mindlessly hunting. It was purposefully removing threats to the continued coexistence between human civilization and the wild things that inhabited the ecosystem. More significantly, the creature had tested me. It had observed whether I would accept the guardian role without requiring proof or external validation. It had assessed my capacity to commit to actions that transcended conventional morality, and it had determined that I possessed the necessary understanding to serve as a reliable custodian of the balance between human and natural forces. This assessment, Margaret Zhang explained, placed me in a new category within the Guardian Network. I was no longer a novice being trained into the role. I had demonstrated sufficient commitment and moral clarity to potentially be moved into a coordinating position, where I would assist other newly awakened guardians in accepting their own roles within the system. The offer was both honor and burden. It meant increased travel between sectors, involvement in the network's strategic planning, and deeper understanding of operations that extended beyond simple wilderness management into something approaching deliberate ecosystemic engineering. I asked Zhang whether I could decline. She smiled and said that I could, but that the offer was being made because the network had assessed that I was precisely the individual needed for this expanded role. The choice was genuinely mine, but choosing to decline would mean accepting a limited perspective on operations that I was already partially engaged in. Choosing to accept would mean understanding the full scope of what the Guardian Network truly represented. I chose to accept. In that moment, I understood that all previous choices had been leading toward this point. My initial assignment to the Cumberland sector had not been random administrative placement. It had been deliberate selection, engineered by people within the system who had recognized something in my background and capabilities that indicated I was suitable for this role. The pattern extended backward through my career. My various transfers, my assignments, my encounters with other rangers, all of it had been orchestrated by network members strategically positioned within the ranger service and the administrative apparatus. I had been selected, cultivated, and ultimately awakened into my true role over a period of years. Margaret Zhang and Samuel Thorne remained at the mountain station for an additional week after they completed their formal assessment. During this time, they introduced me to the broader network framework and explained the true nature of the Guardian system. The creature in the Cumberland Mountains was not an aberration. It was one of approximately 47 major entities that inhabited the wild spaces of North America. These were the remnants of a biological and quasi-biological ecosystem that had existed before human consciousness had fully developed or organized itself into civilizational structures. The indigenous peoples of North America had achieved something that modern civilization had lost: a working understanding of how to coexist with these creatures without seeking to either eliminate them or be eliminated by them. They had developed protocols, rituals, and systematic practices that had allowed human civilization and natural entities to occupy the same landscapes for thousands of years with a degree of balance that was precarious but sustainable. European colonization had disrupted this balance catastrophically. The newcomers lacked the knowledge and respect for the protocols. They sought to eliminate the creatures, to tame the wilderness, to expand human control over every aspect of the natural world. The result was increased predation, increased conflict, and a mounting death toll that remained largely invisible because it was attributed to wilderness accident rather than animal predation or supernatural phenomenon. By the 20th century, a handful of individuals within the scientific and administrative establishments had begun to recognize the true nature of what was occurring. They had made contact with the remaining indigenous peoples who still maintained traditional knowledge. They had begun to recruit rangers and wilderness administrators who could be trusted with forbidden knowledge. The Guardian Network in its modern form had crystallized around this recognition that silent coexistence was preferable to either extermination or public exposure. The network was not unified in the sense of having explicit organizational hierarchy. It operated through distributed decision-making, loose affiliation, and a shared understanding that the primary mission was maintaining the balance between human and natural forces. Some guardians in the network were more sympathetic to the creature's needs. Others focused on minimizing human suffering through careful victim selection. All recognized that the status quo represented the least terrible available option. Margaret Zong then told me something that Thorne had deliberately withheld. Samuel Thorne was not human, in the sense that modern consciousness typically understood humanity. He was approximately 217 years old. He was the product of a transgressive union between a human woman and one of the creatures that inhabited the Appalachian region. He possessed the longevity and partial nature connection of his non-human parent, but retained enough human consciousness to function as an intermediary between the network and the creatures themselves. Thorne did not deny this. He confirmed it with the casual acceptance of someone discussing a simple fact. He explained that he was one of perhaps 9 individuals in the network who possessed this dual nature. These hybrid individuals served as primary coordinators and interpreters, translating the needs and intentions of the creatures into action that the human guardians could implement. This revelation should have violated my understanding of biological possibility and psychological coherence. Instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had been slowly assembling itself throughout my awakening into the guardian role. The universe was not arranged according to the principles that modern civilization assumed. Reality operated on multiple levels, with older forces and entities coexisting beneath the surface of human awareness. Margaret Zhang remained at the station for an additional 3 days after Thorne departed. She provided me with administrative materials that would formalize my movement into the coordinator role. She explained the communication protocols used by the network, the funding mechanisms that allowed guardians to operate without excessive bureaucratic scrutiny, and the criteria for identifying and recruiting new guardians into the system. She also provided me with something that she described as the elder's perspective. This came in the form of a personal letter from an individual identified only as HB, a founding member of the modern Guardian Network whose work extended back to the 1930s. The letter was written in careful, elegant script. It contained a meditation on the nature of the covenant between human and natural forces. The author, HB, expressed the view that the Guardian Network represented humanity's last opportunity to learn the lessons that indigenous civilizations had understood for millennia. The creatures that inhabited wild spaces were not evil or malicious. They were simply other, operating according to principles that transcended human morality but reflected their own logic and necessity. The author wrote, "We are not guardians in the sense of warriors or defenders. We are stewards of a covenant that requires sacrifice from both parties. The creatures sacrifice their isolation and their freedom from human interference. We sacrifice our innocence and our comfort with simplified morality. The balance is imperfect. The price is steep, but the alternative is the erasure of something precious and irreplaceable, the wild other that existed before human consciousness attempted to domesticate all of creation." In the final paragraphs, HB addressed the specific moral question that every new guardian eventually confronts. How can you justify the deaths that your role necessitates? The author's response was unsentimental but profound. Every guardian must accept that they are not in a position to create the universe according to their preference. The creatures exist. The balance must be maintained. The old covenant must be honored. The alternative is not a world where no one dies, but a world where both humans and the wild things perish together in a conflict that neither side can win. By accepting the guardian role, we are not becoming murderers, HB wrote. We are becoming midwives of a necessary death that is already inscribed into the fabric of natural reality. The individuals who disappear during the equinox cycles would not survive in a world where the creatures were eliminated or starved. They would not survive because that world would collapse into chaos and violence as the wild things fought for survival against a humanity that no longer understood how to coexist with forces beyond its control. The guardian role is the price we pay for being conscious enough to understand what is happening. It is also the privilege of being among the few who recognize the true nature of the covenant that holds human civilization and natural forces in precarious balance. After Margaret Zhang departed, I remained alone at the mountain station with a complete understanding of my role and my purpose. I had become something more than a ranger. I had become a guardian in the deepest sense, one who understood that the wilderness I was meant to protect contained forces that would never be tamed, that could only be negotiated with through sacrifice and respect. The autumn equinox was approaching. The creature in the mountains was beginning to stir. My task was clear. I would review the hiking permits. I would identify the necessary offerings. I would guide them toward the ceremonial grounds with the same professionalism that I had employed in previous cycles. Some would disappear. Some would be consumed by the distance between moments. Some would be sacrificed to the ancient covenant that existed long before human consciousness emerged, and would persist long after human civilization had crumbled into dust. And I would do this work, knowing that it was necessary, that it was right in the deepest sense, and that it was the only way to honor both the wild things that predated human consciousness and the communities of people who depended on the covenant being maintained. This is my testimony. This is the truth that cannot be officially acknowledged. This is the burden that I have accepted and will carry until the day when I can pass it to another who possesses the wisdom to understand what I have come to know. Listen carefully, listener. If you hike in the mountains during the equinox seasons, if you find yourself drawn to the wilderness precisely when the boundaries between moments grow thin, pay attention to the feeling. It is not accident that brings you there. It is possibility. It is recognition. The creatures are calling. They have always been calling. And some of us have finally learned how to answer. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories from the Guardians, to hear more testimony from those of us who understand what lies beneath the surface of official narrative, to hear the voices of those who have seen through the illusion of human dominion and recognized the covenant that truly holds creation in balance. The mountains are watching, the creatures are waiting, and the Guardians are walking among you, carrying burdens that you cannot perceive, maintaining a balance that you cannot imagine. Until the next season of transition, until the next equinox, until you find yourself standing at the boundary between the known and unknown, and someone offers to guide you toward the truth, pay attention. Because the Cumberland dragon is always hungry, and the Guardians are always watching.